So, first, some definition. The Holocaust was the state-sponsored, and that's important, of approximately 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and their helpers. Very important too. A lot of the killing was done not by Germans, but by those sympathetic to the Nazis. During the Second War, from 39 to 45, at the end, 6 million Jews were murdered. 2/3 of the Jews of Europe and 1/3 of the Jewish population of the world, and the whole center of Jewish life switched to eventually to Israel and to the United States. The important thing here is state-sponsored. You can have a bunch of kooks on television saying, you know, this group so-and-so, that group so-and-so, immigrants, whatever. It's a lot of talk. But once it's state's power, when you have the weapons of the state, the police, arrest power, jails, guns, airplanes, then it gets serious. Hitler was just an idiot standing on a soapbox in the very early 20s. But in 1933, when he was elected chancellor, things changed. He had the power of the state. Why the Jews? You cannot understand the Holocaust without at least knowing the definition of anti-Semitism, which is hate or contempt of Jews as Jews. It's absolutely fine to hate Jews, a Jew. If you have a neighbor who has a 50-year-old car and cement blocks, never cuts the lawn, and plays rock music at midnight, and you can't stand those guys, not good neither. But hating Jews as Jews is anti-Semitism. And again, the definition is important. It's hatred, contempt, and fear of Jews. All of us have prejudices, I assume. Somebody has to look down on somebody. How can you get through the day? But the difference in this prejudice is the fear of Jews. Because of the birth of Christianity, Jews have been, and I'll get quickly into it, have been ascribed to having powers they don't have. They represent less than 1% of the population. But I gave a talk a few months ago at a high school in West Rochester. The town's so small, I remember the name. I said, do any of you know anybody, do any of you have Jewish friends? High school kids, not a one. Does anybody know anybody who's Jewish? Not a one. Anybody hear about Jews and money? 10 hands go up. Interesting. They had never met a Jew, but they'd heard about Jews and money. So this idea that Jews have power or money, or the media or so, has a 2,000-year history. And for Christian Europe at the time of the Nazis, and unfortunately it has not ended, anti-Semitism came with mother's milk. It wasn't that all Germans or anybody else were all homicidal. They weren't. But Jews were different. They were marginal, and especially in Christian countries to the east, they were Christ killers. The background, without wasting too much time of it, is Jesus was a Jew. He was a rabbi, he was a teacher, and Judaism has a concept of a Messiah who's going to come down from the heavens and make everything good. And throughout history, Jewish history, there have been people who said, I'm a Messiah, and no one would say, get out of here, you're not. But Jesus, a religious Jew, had the Nazarenes, a group of followers, and he was a troublemaker. At that time, Palestine was occupied by the Romans. The Romans said, if you pay your taxes and you don't make trouble, it's okay with us. Religion's not an issue with us. But he was an irritant to the Jewish leadership there. Eventually, as all of you know, he was turned over to the Romans. The Jews didn't kill him. He was turned over to the Romans. He was executed in the manner that people executed for all sorts of times, where some of the Jewish leadership sad to see him go. No. He was an annoyance. He was a rabble-rouser. His movement should have died out because the leader was gone. But a man named Paul started spreading the word of what I call Jewish light into the civilized world. Judaism was a difficult religion. Nobody wants to be circumcised at age 21. It's totally unappealing. But this new Judaism light was very welcoming, and always, again, think of the times. Life expectancy was maybe 30 years. Life was tough. Everything was mysterious. There was no education, and this new Christian light later in 325, when they became accepted as an official religion of Rome, and stopped getting eaten by the lions. It was a welcoming religion, all-inclusive, and it promised a life ever after when life on earth was crummy. So it was an appealing religion, and it grew quickly. But the frustration was, how come the Jews, the brothers, the sisters, the cousins, the mishpacha from Jesus didn't buy into it? And they had a marketing problem. And the basic thing was, remember, mysterious times, there were two forces, the God and the devil. And the devil was as powerful for evil as the God was as powerful as good. So the early Christians had to solve the marketing problem by saying the Jews were the spawns of the devil. And from that point forth, the Jews were seen as satanic and greedy, and Christ kills them, rejected by God. And also Judaism was seen as a replacement religion. Christianity was seen as the replacement religion for Judaism, which was the egg that brought forth the true religion. This anti-Semitism, which went on for 2,000 years, was the default situation in Christian countries, including the U.S. General Ulysses S. Grant wanted to expel all the Jews from Tennessee because he accused them of trading with the enemy, the Confederates, until Abraham Lincoln said, Ulysses, get off it, it's dumb. And he backed off, but that's in America. I still remember when I was younger, you couldn't go to the Lake Placid Country Club, no Jews or dogs allowed. So this has a 2,000-year history. And the reason I point it out is Hitler did not invent Nazi anti-Semitism. It was always there. It was a handy tool. And of course, it was at the time of the Bolshevik Revolution, which had participation from many Jews, because the Tsar was not particularly sympathetic to the religion. So Hitler seized on feelings that to some degree were already there. However, anti-Semitism until the mid-19th century was based on religion, but with Darwinism and the growth of education and the less mystery, the traditional anti-Semites sort of lost hold, because people didn't believe so much in the devil anymore. Some do. It was a new society, so anti-Semitism, and this is important, made a shift from this classical religious mystical, which you can change by just changing the religion. Many Jews were forced to do that. Many of them did so voluntarily because life was too tough being Jewish, career-wise or social-wise. But the new anti-Semitism, the racial anti-Semitism, which is what Nazi anti-Semitism was based on the color of your skin and your DNA. You couldn't change it. The Jews were just inferior genetically, and that you can't change your genetics. A good thing to remember: bad things happen in bad times. World War I, there was supposed to be the guns of August in a few months, and Germany would be victorious. Lasted from 1914 to 1918, the most awful war until World War II. The entire young male population of Europe was decimated. Horrible new weapons, barbed wire, tanks, poison gas, machine guns, trench warfare, diphtheria. It was so cataclysmic that it also, among many other things, plus the Treaty of Versailles. And the interesting thing was that Germany, this was before mass bombings, there were airplanes, Germany itself was sort of untouched. And the army was still intact to a certain extent. And the Germans looked around and they said, what happened? Because the killing was in the fields of Flanders and France and all. And the right wing, the Nazis being just one of many, the one that was victorious, said, we were not defeated, we were stabbed in the back, they dodged us. Oh, and who did that? The Jews and the Bolsheviks. Remember, this was a time of the Russian Revolution. And people accepted that. So they said, the Germans had lost their pride by a rather ruinous and vengeful Versailles Treaty, and here the right wing was saying, no, it wasn't us, It was the Jews and the Bolsheviks, which to them meant exactly the same thing. So when you think of Nazi anti-Semitism, that's at the root cause. We'll get into the Holocaust, well, rather not. Talk quickly about what does 6 million mean? First of all, why do Jews carry on about 6 million? Anybody have an idea how many people were killed for various reasons and in various methods in World War II? Yeah, don't really know, but at least 50 million. So why are the Jews, and the Nazis killed about 11 million civilians, including 5 million Jews, the rest mostly Poles and Russian, because the war against the Jews was annihilationist. The Nazis killed lots of Russians, but they never set out to kill all of them. They certainly didn't set out to kill Russian babies and little children. They killed lots of Poles, mostly the intelligentsia, those that posed the threat. They never went out, with some exceptions, to kill babies and all. But the war against the Jews was total. At the Wannsee Conference in January 20th, 1942, the Nazis got together and basically agreed that the Jews were to disappear to the left, except for some bones for a museum. It was Nazi policy until the very end, to absolutely eradicate the Jewish race from the face of the earth. And that's saying, why am I standing here? If you have heard any other survivor, the only explicit reason for survival was basically luck. Because if the Germans put you in a ditch or a wall, your luck ran out. But on the other hand, we all know that luck is not evenly distributed. It's better to be rich than to be poor. It's better to be good looking than not so good looking. It's better to be healthy than sick. It's better to be smart than to be stupid. And all of us have some pieces of luck and some pieces of no luck. But luck made all the difference in the world. You could not control your fate, but you could just be lucky. You could have missed that train. You could have hidden for something. Somebody might have hidden you when you didn't expect it. So since all the Jews were condemned, absolutely condemned without exception, the only explanation is that some people were luckier. The war ending when it did was lucky, because had it lasted 2 more years, you'd have to have another guest speaker, because my sister and I and our family would have been dead by then. Essentially, luck is really, it's a simple answer, but it's the only answer I've ever come up with. Now, about my family, my father, my parents were young. They were well educated. They, like most Europeans, they spoke several languages. My father was a very successful employee of a large multinational silk company. He was also handsome, blonde, and blue-eyed. He looked much more like an Aryan than an Aryan. I mean, if you look at the leaders of the Nazi party, Goebbels and the whole thing, that's Himmler. I mean, that's a pretty bad picture of an Aryan. But my father was blonde and blue-eyed. The Germans absolutely hated him. My parents were very resourceful. My mother was particularly beautiful. Most kids think their mothers are beautiful, but my mother really was. It saved our lives on multiple occasions. I will get into that. My mother was only in her early 20s. She was the only child of a well-to-do merchant who had a small department store, and they were one of my father's customers. Her parents were royally ticked off when this older man stole their young, beautiful daughter away, but they perished in the Holocaust. Anyway, but in 1935, the Nazis came to power over a period starting in 1933, although the Nazi movement goes back to the early 20s, but they came to power January of 1933. And it took time, to rearm Germany, to ignore the Treaty of Versailles, military, and to win over. There was a very, very strong anti-Nazi feeling. So the first concentration camp, Dachau, was built just 90 days after Hitler came to power. It was not intended for Jews in particular, but it was intended to get rid of the opponents of the regime, the communists, who were very strong. And when you start seeing your neighbors disappear in the middle of the night, the comment that you might have mentioned the day before about Hitler, so you might think the next day that you ought to not make those comments. So slowly but surely, a regime of total terror took place in Germany. When the Nazis spoke about getting rid of the Jews in the 30s, they meant extrusion, to make Germany Judenrein, to cleanse it of all Jews. The Holocaust, murdering other people, that took a lot of thinking. It had never been done before. How do you do it? How are people going to take it? Are they going to object to it or whatever? No one knew. That was a development. But in the 30s, the whole thing was getting rid of the Jews with extrusion. The problem with that was that the Jews, especially in Germany, were highly acculturated. Many didn't even know they were Jews. Their grandfather had converted years ago, and it took Hitler to point out their Jewishness. So I'm an American. I never think of myself, other than the bar mitzvahs we have to go to. I never think of myself as a Jew. I'm not religious, but I certainly think of myself as an American. Wear a flag every day. So the German Jews, by and large, were very acculturated. 100,000 of them fought in World War I, and 12,000 died for the Kaiser. So when this idiot Hitler gets up, the Jews, they'd heard it all before. They were German citizens. And so they didn't want to leave Germany. But worse than that, who would take them? America certainly wouldn't, Canada wouldn't, Australia wouldn't. There was no place to go. And the other issue is that you couldn't take anything with you. 10 marks, or whatever you could stuff it in some parts of your body. If you had a business, you had to walk away from it or sell it at a deep discount. If you had a house and a nice Mercedes, you had to just leave the keys at the door. You couldn't take anything with you. Not very conducive to leaving. The Holocaust had to be invented. Had people known what was over the horizon, they would have run barefoot on the cobbled street to get out of Germany. But it was unimaginable, which meant that my relatives, my father paid for several of his sister, brother-in-law, his parents, paid for them to get to America late on the last ship, as a matter of fact. But my father did not, because he felt this too shall pass, and my father was deeply ingrained in the status quo. He was successful, he had a horse, a beautiful house, and everything. He wasn't going to just walk away because the Holocaust had to be invented. But by 1935, I'm just going to make sure that I'm sticking to my time. How am I doing? I think fine. I'll keep my watch. In 1935, the Nazis passed the Nuremberg laws, which basically turned German Jews from citizens to subjects, where they were in the Middle Ages, which basically means the Jews could no longer work, they couldn't hold positions, they could only deal with other Jews. At that point, my father said it was a senior manager at a large company. His boss, whose name I never knew and I never asked. By the way, I've been very careful of it. I want to digress for a second. I wasn't even born. I wasn't even gleaming in my parents' eye at the time. But I've been very careful. I mean, I've been a bit of a Holocaust scholar for 40 years. It's my area of interest and a survivor. But years ago, when my mother was alive, I would have, I can't even say dreams, I would have remembrances. And I would call my mother, who lived in D.C. at the time, and she had all her marbles till the late 80s, and she was very perceptive. And I'd say, Mom, I remembered this. And I'd describe what I remembered, and she had one of three reactions. She had a very strong German accent, which I love to imitate. I'd say, Mom, I remember this and this, and my mother would say, Ach, Stephen, I don't remember this at all. And I hit the delete button on my hard disk. Or my mother would often say, I know what you were talking about, but it wasn't in this place, it was there. And I'd say, Mom, tell me more. We'd have a half-hour conversation. And often she'd say, that's exactly right. And I said, can you tell me anything else? So I've been very, very careful, because this is not a subject that you BS about. It's way too serious. So I didn't have any documentary proof or straight from Mom's mouth. I simply deleted it from my memories. So my father's boss said to my father, a German, but a good German, said to my father's boss, my father's name was Karl at the time, later Charles. My original name was Stefan, after Stefan Zweig, and to my great regret and my dating career, all the girls said, "Why do you have to change your name?" So my father's boss said, we've got to figure something out. And they applied to the German government to have my father transferred to the office in Holland and bring back their non-Jewish manager and solve the problem. So my parents actually had official permission to leave Germany, but the big thing of this was that they could take their stuff as long as they weren't valuables. My father, when they had, like, in the old Kodak days when Dad got transferred to San Diego, and Mom stayed behind till the kids finished school, and the house was sold, my mother stayed behind to arrange things, and my father went ahead. So this is a wonderful story that you'll never hear it again because it's beyond imagination. So my mother was telling the story. I said my mother was very good looking, and the Germans sent a policeman. I can't even say he was a Nazi. Not everybody was a Nazi, but a policeman, a detective, to the house every day to make sure that my mother wasn't packing up silverware and valuables. And my mother was telling me, she was in her late 80s, and she said, "Stephen, I knew he wasn't looking at my packing." She said, "I played him like such a fish." And I said, "Mom, what do you, tell me more." She said, "Well, I say Herr Schmidt, whatever his name was, eine Tasse Kaffee bitte. Would you like a cup of coffee? Wollen Sie ein Butterbrot? Would you like a sandwich?" And this young cop, was looking at my mother up and down, didn't see what she was doing, and said, "Oh, nein, danke, Frau Hess," a real good-looking chick, 23 years old. In the meantime, my mother was wrapping up silverware in the sheets and the towels and stuff, and a lot of stuff survived. Well, the end of the story was that in Europe, when people got married, the traditional gift was a box of silverware, the velvet thing with the cutouts of the fish forks and stuff like that. My mother had 3. She had her own. She had that of my father's parents who were planning at the time to get to America and couldn't possibly take her with them. And she had the set from her parents who refused to leave Germany. So I gotta fess up. I've been married a few times. So, and at each occasion, my mother, luckily she had enough silver, while I had few enough marriages. She gave the new wife a set of the silver. And in the middle of this conversation of leaving Germany, my mother stopped and looked at me, and she said, "Stephen, it is amazing. Your ex-wife has accomplished what Hitler never did. They got the silver." I said to my mother, "Mom, not to worry. They can't take it with them. One set's already back to the kids." So, but it was, well, maybe not funny, but it was just an interesting vignette. When my mother, here's a hint: if America ever turns an awful lot worse and you're headed for Venezuela, forget the credit cards or forget the cash. Well, cash are right. Refugees know that the best thing is jewels. They don't appreciate. You can hide them in all interesting parts of your body. They're valuable everywhere, and refugees know that. So my mother, over time, collected as much jewelry as possible, which German marks weren't dependable, and there were no credit cards. And this story was fabulous, but I told you about luck, and my mother was beautiful. Only she could have gotten away with it. The day that she left Germany on a train, she was telling me this in the late 80s, she said, "I put on a red jacket I had bought with black velvet lapels I had mesh stockings on. I had lipstick all over my face and makeup. And I had all this jewelry on my lapels. And her exact words was, I looked like a 10-mark hooker. And she got on the train, this slut. And nobody ever suspected all that stuff was real. And the real story is that one piece of jewelry worth 60,000 marks at the time, about $60,000, saved our lives. We never got it back, but it saved our lives. So luck and strange things happen. My importance of doing, let me just check the time because I promise I'll stay in time. I'm doing well till 12:30, right? Good. Pardon me? Oh, I don't have any control. Do you want to move up here a little bit? Because I have no control over the mic. But
If you could speak more into your mic.
Oh, well, but I would have to put the jacket over my head. Let me see where. Let me see. You know what? I'm going to try. Me too. Yeah. How's that? Is that okay? So hope it's not too loud for the rest of you. I'm the family historian, and my mother, in her later years, turned everything over to me, and I have a huge library and all the family photos and papers, and just last month there was a whole thing in the newspaper about Paraguayan passports given to Jews. I have one. Didn't help us, but so my sister went to Poland last week to be honored. I said, find some other place to be honored. But anyway, all expenses paid. I stayed here. But the interesting thing was, as I always said, put yourself in the time and the place, and not from 50,000 feet. My mother gave me this photograph. My parents were in Holland, and I being an historian, and it's 2019 or whatever. I see the last summer in Zandvoort. That's a Dutch beach, and 1939. And I'm the cute one that my mother's holding. My sister's sitting in the weeds there, and I said, "Mom, why are you smiling? It's 1939. The world's about to blow apart." And my mother looked at me and said, "What are you talking about? We were in Holland. Dad had a great job. In fact, I asked her, I said, why don't you have children? And she says, it was wonderful. We were out of Nazi Germany. Dad was, life was great. It was a great time to have children, because my mother could not look over the horizon, because nobody could. And so here I am. Tough to talk to your mother about why they had children. But the point is that, and the other thing, for those of you who are amateur historians, is that World War I had only been about 20 years in the past. I remember Vietnam like it happened yesterday. World War I was very much in the minds of people. I mean, you still saw the faceless ones in France and amputees all over the place. It was like it happened yesterday. But the important thing was that Holland was neutral during World War I. So the 20,000 German Jews and some Frenchmen and some Poles who reluctantly were accepted by the Dutch as refugees thought they were safe because Holland had been neutral in World War I, and they expected that the Nazis would respect Dutch neutrality. That's why my mother is smiling. She was wrong. The invasion in May of 1940 was a huge shock to Holland. Hitler saw Holland very much as he saw Austria, that this was a country of Aryans, other than the Jews, and it was to be enveloped into the greater German Reich in the same way as Austria did. So the number one, it was an incredible shock to the Dutch, but the Dutch had the third largest Nazi party in Europe. You had Germany, you had Austria, and you had Holland. 10% of the vote in 1933 in Holland went for the Dutch Nazi party. Also, Holland is a trading nation, and their whole attitude is going along to get along. But the most deadly, well, one of the most deadly things was that the occupation by the Germans in Holland was more of a civil occupation. Yes, there were tons of soldiers and there were tanks, but it wasn't like Poland. But the Nazis had the Dutch bureaucracy, the banks, the medical community, the legislature, the academy, all the institutions worked for the Germans day and night. So did they like the Germans? No. But get along, moving on, was the Dutch philosophy. But what that meant for the Jews was that they were totally exposed. They knew my father had a car, he had 2 bicycles, they knew where all the Jews were. And of course, Holland was also a very small country, twice as high as New Jersey, flat, no place to hide, surrounded by danger. So Holland, you think of Anne Frank and wooden shoes and tulips, but you ought to recall that Holland was the deadliest place for Jews in Western Europe. Of the 110,000 Jews from Holland, not all Dutch Jews, of the 110,000 Jews from Holland out of a Jewish population of 140, of the 110,000 Jews that were deported, fewer than 5% survived, including my family. And of that 5%, 800 of them were still in Westerbork where they were safe. So Holland was by far the deadliest country for Jews in the West, but at the time, who knew? This picture was taken at the time. Once the Germans invaded, the Jews were restricted to movement. They had to stay inside. My parents had a nanny who had these Dutch costumes, and we have a whole series of those. And I said, "What's the deal with the costumes, Mom?" And she said, "Well, the man who took the photograph was a very well-known Dutch Amsterdam photographer named Fisher, and this is pre-digital, so it took a while. Sometime after these photographs were delivered to my parents, the Nazis caught Mr. Fisher making false ID cards, put him against the wall, and shot him. So I had this minor mission to keep his name alive. I know nothing more about him. But look how dangerous it had a pointer. School can't afford it. You can see how dangerous Holland was if you study it. Here was on the east, Nazi Germany. You weren't going to run in that direction. To the south, occupied France and Belgium. You weren't going to go there. And to the west, the hostile North Sea. Again, a flat country twice as high as New Jersey, and there simply was no escape. It was just a matter of time. The deportation of Jews from Western Europe didn't really start till 1942, although the killing process in these concentration camps started, Dachau was established in 1933. So the whole process, the Holocaust, started much earlier. But because the Nazis were winging it, how do you kill 6 million people? Most of them were shot, which was messy. There was, for any of you who ever, hopefully not, doubt that all this happened, let me just put in just a side comment. All the documentation, with the exception of some of the Ringelbaum letters that were found after in the ghettos, but all the documentation of the Holocaust are German documents, not from Jews. I have a total set of blueprints of the gas chambers. There were 100 sets printed. I have 1 set of them. There were letters going back and forth to Berlin. Latvia is Judenfrei, together with a beautiful graphic with a coffin and a number on the coffin. So all the documentation, or let's say 90% of it, are German documents and not by Jews or Americans or anybody else. It happened. The deportation, as I said, did not start till about 1942 because most of the Jews were in Eastern Europe, and it took the Nazis a couple of years to figure out how to kill them and to actually do it and to discover, again, first they started shooting them and then letters to Himmler. It's very demoralizing, not for the Jews, it's very demoralizing for the German soldiers to have to kill babies all the time. So somebody came up with the idea of, oh, not only that, the townspeople would come out with their kids and eat ice cream and watch the Jews being shot. In 1941, September, 39,000 Jews shot in 24 hours at Baba Yar. In the open, no secrets, being marched down the street into a ditch and shot. So it was a messy affair. They weren't concerned about the effect of the Jews, they were concerned on the effect of the local population and on the soldiers having to do this dishonorable, no, not dishonorable, but necessary business. So somebody had the idea, well, why don't we take a truck, a moving truck, and hook the engine into the back, and they developed a gas fan. And the letters that went back and forth to Berlin are unbelievable. The roads in Russia were, and I assume are, still terrible. And the letter goes, then they would load the Jews into 80, there were two sizes, about 80 Jews in the back of a truck. And they'd run the truck around at Chelmno, 20 minutes till all the Jews were dead. And the letter said, when the operation begins, the subjects, they never talk about people or human beings, the Jews, the subjects rush towards the rear of the container. Of course they would, they want to get out. And what happens? The front of the truck would lift up. So the truck became uncontrollable. These were the things that civilians and the Gestapo were worried about. So someone said, we don't need a truck, we just need the engine. So then they built the first death camp at Chelmno, where they used a Russian, it's either a tank or a U-boat engine, and marked it and taped up the windows, and that was the first gas chamber. And these poor Jews were in terror in a sealed room, and the engine wouldn't start. Whoa, 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 whoa. And finally it would start, and it wasn't until somebody in Auschwitz used a very popular decontamination agent for vermin and stuff, and threw it through a window where 50 Russian prisoners were held, that it was a eureka moment. They finally found out how to kill people en masse very cheaply, a penny apiece. And from that point on, Auschwitz was able to kill up to 15,000 people a day. What they couldn't do was get rid of the bodies. That was the holdup. So the point really is that the deportations in the West took time because they were killing off all the Jews in the East. Once they started deporting the Jews from Holland, there was right up here was a camp called Westerbork, which was built by the Dutch, paid for by the Jews, to house immigrants fleeing from Germany. I mean, immigration problems have a long history, but the Dutch answer was, well, we won't refuse them, but they got to stay in this camp. When the Nazis invaded, they said, wow, isn't that handy? There's a camp right there, and they turned it into a Durchgangslager, a transit camp. And the Jews from Holland were brought most nights first to a theater in Amsterdam, and then by train to Westerbork. And Westerbork, it was a camp, it was run by the Dutch. Collaboration was widespread. My sister and I remember when we were picked up in the middle of the night, banging on the door, and all the Jews who had any brains had suitcases packed, because when they knocked on the door, you only had 5 minutes to get your stuff together. And I still remember one was a rucksack with a metal frame. They were always next to the door, so when the moment came, you could grab whatever you took, some clothing, some photographs, maybe some jewelry, or maybe some piece of bread, whatever you would take if you had 5 minutes to get out of town. And so they started collecting the Jews and sent them to Westerbork, which was not a concentration camp. They weren't killing people. It was nasty, it was fly-ridden. The Dutch ran it. There weren't that many Germans involved in it. But the point was that they weren't killing people there. They were holding them for deportation. How am I doing? Okay, I've got another half hour, right? Good. I'm staying on task. I need more time for the final. Westerbork, the whole thing about Westerbork were the train tracks in the middle, because every Tuesday an empty train would come in there, and the Nazis would have put out the word by Friday that they wanted 1,800 Jews for the train on Tuesday. Who picked these people? Well, the camp was run by German Jews inside, because the German Jews were the ones who were there, it was built for, so they were sort of the hierarchy in there. And they were at their typewriters picking out Jews. Would they put their children in it? No. Their parents? No. Their wives? Well, that depends. Did the Germans care? Not at all. Why? Because on Tuesday, they had 1,800 Jews. And the next week, somebody else was at the typewriter, and they took care of the other man's children and not his own. Was there corruption? Absolutely. Everybody wanted to live. Everybody wanted to stay in Westerbork. They would do anything to stay there. These trains left on Tuesday. They went to unknown destinations. They came back cleaned the following week. This was Westerbork. It was like a cowboy. I think it was a cowboy town. It was flea-ridden, dirty, but it also held the best of the brightest conductors and composers and authors and artists. I mean, but to the Nazis, they were just expendable Jews. But again, it was not. People were not being murdered there, and all they wanted to do was not leave, because it was safe. But leave they did on about 100 trains over several years. The latest one in late '44. The trains went to these 4 places. 19 trains went to Sobibor with 34,000 Jews from Holland. At the end of the war, 19 were alive, no children. 55,000 went to Auschwitz. At the end of the war, about 1,000 Jews from Holland were alive, no children under 15. 7 trains went to Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia. Most of them ended up in Auschwitz and were murdered. 9 trains went to Bergen-Belsen, which is in Germany. It was the only place that was partly survival, even though of Dr. Brown's accurate description of the camp. But the camp did not have gas chambers. It took long to kill people. The day before, actually the week before, I was always in a hospital there. I have a big hole behind my ear, a lasting souvenir. And the week before, and people were told that the Jews were being taken for labor in the East. And the week before the train, they emptied out the hospital. All these children, most of them orphans by that time, carried on stretchers on this train. And the truth finally penetrated that they weren't using 2-year-olds for labor. And my father said to my mother, "We have to get out of here." It still gets to me 7 years later. My father said to my mother, "We can't stay here," because I was always sick with ear infections. And my father, I don't know whether he paid somebody, whether because he was German, I have no idea, but he somehow got listed on the train to Bergen-Belsen in 1944, and it was the only place that we could have survived. Just pure luck. And his reasoning was that Bergen-Belsen was in Germany, and he told my mother, when the war is finished, it'll be easy to get home. That's all he knew. This is an actual picture of the cars at Westerbork. 80 people to a car, no sanitation, one bucket, no water. These trains, when they arrived at the concentration camps, 10% of the people were dead. They were old, they were sick, infirm. There was, again, no water, no food, no toilet facilities. Bergen-Belsen was only a day away. And you were simply locked in these trains. This is also Westerbork, and you see a child and the mother, fathers, I can't tell, arms, and another child up in the train. They were all dead by the time that train, they were all to be killed by the time that train reached its destination. The list I told you about, this is the list of the train that we were on. I tried to get the whole list, but the Dutch government talked about privacy. I said they're all dead. So I finally was able to get, I have the complete list, but they sent me which are some names. I think today the word is redacted. They sent me a redacted list, and out of 773 people, there we are, my father, my mother, my sister, and myself. From Celle, that's where the train's going, and it says Judentransport aus der Nederlands Lager Westerbork, Jew transport it's my twin sister. So she should know better. My apologies. And here at Bergen-Belsen Westerbork is over here, and here is Bergen-Belsen. Bergen-Belsen was a large camp, had many sub-camps. We were in the star camp below. Why? Because we wore whatever clothing we had, and all Jews wore a yellow star, so they called it the star camp. It was also designated a camp for prominent Jews, meaning Jews who might have value to trade for Germans and for German property that were in Allied hands. It only happened once, but they were called the Prominenten, and they were kept in the star camp. But because we had a passport to Paraguay, it was more useful in the latrine than for getting to Paraguay, but we did have one. This was the camp. The temperatures were very much like over here, fine in spring and summer, absolutely brutal in the winter, unheated barracks. In the morning, all the Jews had to gather at 6 o'clock to be counted. Thousands died in that process because you would just be held up by your neighbors, and people would just sink and die out in the freezing cold with just the rags they had on. It was called a pell, and it was in all the camps. And funny how you remember things from 5 years old. We had a ditty, Appell, Appell, dann macht der Jude schnell. Assembly, assembly, the Jews hurry up. The camp was surrounded by electrified barbed wire. People committed suicide commonly by running to the wire. If you got too close to it, you were shot. There were guard towers, you can see them in the back, all around the camp. These photos were taken after the liberation. The barracks, again, they were unheated. They had no facilities. You shared a bunk. It's actually a slab with one other person. I was matched up with somebody who was quite overweight. I mean, people came as they came. They didn't all get stuff. They didn't arrive starved. One morning, that woman was dead, and I remembered it as one of the better days of my life because I had this plank to myself. There was no heat, and you'll never heard this. You'll never hear this again because it's not even written down. There was a stove in the back, but there was no fuel. So the Jews would take a plank out. Well, originally these things had ticking, sort of, not a beauty rest or a thermopedic, nothing like that. A sack with hay in it. But lice were all over the camp. My sister and I and other children would pick them out of each other's hair, and I still remember the clicking sound, the snapping sound when you snap a lice between your fingers. It just burned in me. But that was life. It wasn't, oh my God, what's happening to us? It was just, it itched and whatever, and there's one, and we snapped it. So what happened, the lice, which caused the major death issue with typhoid and typhus, these mattresses, these sacks were full of lice, so they burned them. So you were sleeping on a plank, but then you needed more fuel. The winter was long. So they would remove one plank from a certain number of these bunks and use it for fuel. But that necessitated spreading out the remaining planks, which had then a little space in it. But then you needed more fuel. So you again took a plank out, and the space got bigger and bigger. And finally you couldn't do it anymore because all of us by that time were skin and bones. I weighed about 40 pounds, and you were up against the edge of a wooden board with your bones, and that was the end of that. But again, And these photos were all taken by the British. If this bothers you, I see some young kids just look away, but it is what it is. So one school asked me not to show it. I said, why do you even want me here? You know, the camp had 10,000 unburied bodies at any one time. They were naked because when they were hauled out of the barracks, those still alive wanted the clothing. There was no one to bury them. They were all over, and my sister and I learned to count on them because the bodies were all twisted. And somewhere there was Anne Frank and her sister Margot and countless of other loved ones. And they were all twisted, and my sister and I and other children would try and figure out which arm was connected to which body and which head belonged. They were just piled up all over. And it wasn't shocking because it's all we knew. I like this photograph because it's interesting. The dehumanizing process that the Germans always compared Jews to vermin. And by turning them into, quote, vermin, they proved their case to themselves at least, how people became so dehumanized. If you look at this photograph, taken after the liberation, people went walking around with Kodaks at the camp. This is the British were there. You see these two, I don't know the point of it, you see these two gentlemen over here. What are they doing? They're taking care of their bodily needs. Look at everybody walking around. If you saw that on the street of Canandaigua, and you say, "Oh, gross," you know, I mean, wouldn't you be shocked? No, nobody's shocked. There were no bathrooms. I didn't see toilet paper for a year and a half. Didn't know what it was. I didn't know what a bed was for a year and a half. I didn't know what a toothbrush was. My mother used to dip her finger in the muddy water outside. Do this, try and keep us clean. We had 2 or 3 sets of clothing. My mother, I forgot about this. My parents tried to get us good clothing and heavy shoes, knowing we were going to be taking them to Holland. And I had a knit wool sweater and pants. And my mother came into the barracks one day horrified because the thread had come loose and I was gleefully unwinding the only sweater I had. My mother was horrified, and I was having this great time as the sweater disappeared. So, another good photograph. There you see 2 people looking arguably for family or loved ones, or somebody. Just about impossible. But the interesting is the 2 women here, peeling a potato, oblivious to 13,000, 10,000 bodies. And as Dr. Brown pointed out, 13,000 died after the liberation. They were too far gone. And the British finally just shoveled everybody. The camp was so dangerous. It had to be burned out, just burned to the ground. So the British, at the time in April, just took a bulldozer and shoveled them all to, I think, 3 or 4 huge ditches up and back there once. And then we finally came to America, our first new car, a Pontiac. And we were the only, my sister and I both went to Columbia. My sister went to Barnard, and our graduation day, my father insisted I join the Navy to pay the country back, but it was a great time of my life, no regrets. And that was the summer. My twin sister and I, my sister's very social, I'm not, and she had 3 birthday parties for herself. But one isn't enough. So she organized one in New York on a yacht to go around Manhattan. And I said to Marion, we did this 70 years ago. Let's take a picture in front of the Statue of Liberty, because I clearly remember the morning we came here, January 1st, it was freezing cold. And my parents got us up on deck, and it meant nothing to me. But it took me like 70 years to start crying when I think of it. And then 2 years ago I took my sons, at my youngest son's invitation, my expense, to Auschwitz, where they got an education that they never really got. I think we have time for Q&A. Okay. Oh, let me tell one other story, because we went there when, how much time do we have? Okay. We went there when the camp was liberated. for some reason, well, no, not some reason, the Nazis attempted, when the Russians reached Auschwitz, Poland, to move the Jews in these death marches to the interior of Germany with some, or they killed them all, which happened in many camps. They thought they could hide what had been done. And Himmler had instructed that no Jew was to be captured alive. You had these death marches, you know, when Germans said, "We knew nothing," these people were marched to Germany the second day, including my neighbor, my next door neighbor. If they fell, they were shot. And many of them, and they passed all the houses and towns, so the Germans knew plenty. In Bergen-Belsen, they put 6,000 Jews, including us, on 3 trains. One train was about 80 people to a cattle car. By this, my father had been beaten to a pulp, and he was just somehow survived. The only food we had was kohlrabis, which were turnips. You even learn how to these turnips were brought out in garbage cans. They were called gemellen, and I've never been able to find a definition, but they were called gemellen. They were corrugated, and you learn. You had a cup on a string or a belt. If you lost your cup, you died, because you couldn't buy another one. You had to maybe steal one or find one, because it was this watery soup, and you can't hold it in your hand, and you became prisoner wise. You didn't. The Nazis used a lot of horses, and a horse would die, or from a bombing or something, and they would chop up this horse and throw it into the gemellen. So the Jews lined up for lunch. It's all in quotes. And if you were too close to the front of the line, the horses sank to the pieces of the horse sank to the bottom, and all you would get is the turnip stuff, which had no nutritional value. If you stood in the back of the line, you could miss out altogether. So you sort of jockeyed for the middle of the line, the kind of concentration camp thinking that people who were there for a while just learn. I asked but when you stop me, when you leave enough time, I won't bother you, but keep looking at my watch. I have 4 children. I asked I could imagine going back to Bergen-Belsen. I'd last a week, maybe. But I cannot imagine having my young children in the camp. And I asked my mother, I constantly spoke to her. It became an obsession, you know. And I said, "Mom, what was it like having Sis and I at age 5, 6, and 7 in the camp?" And I thought she'd say, "Seeing you so dirty, seeing you starved, you know, no flesh in your bones, all those things." She didn't say that. She said to me, "The worst thing was seeing your children never smile." And I said, "Tell me what you're thinking." She said, you and this were gray." That's a word she used. She said, "You didn't cry. If you were put somewhere, you stayed. You didn't complain. You were totally gray." And I'm much more ready than my mother was. And Terence Dupre's excellent book, Extramental Death, goes into that. What happens was, when people starve, the body shuts down. Women didn't menstruate in the camps because you don't have to procreate there. So the body shuts down what it doesn't need. It keeps the heart going and the liver and the brain, but everything slows down, especially the brain. Our thinking process was so slow that was what my mother saw as gray. So we were eventually taken on one of these 3 trains. One train was rescued by the Americans a day or two. It was April 1945. The end of the war was a couple weeks away. It was rescued by American tankers. Another train actually reached Theresienstadt, but no one knows anything more. Our train was known as the Lost Transport later on. It meandered through the Nazi, still war, countryside, stopping all times. The tracks were bombed. The soldiers, the Germans only wanted to get home to their family. They lost their interest in Jews. They just wanted to survive. The train stopped all the time. My father would crawl into a field and get a potato, or a couple potatoes, or stuff his finger with potatoes. he'd bring them back, but he wouldn't give them to us till it was nightfall in order not to start a food fight. And I still, to this day, I remember what it feels like with your filthy fingernails to go into a raw potato when you get out as water. And my sister and I were eating this potato in the middle of the night. And once my father missed a train, a whole story that I can't even tell you about it, because we don't have the time. But anyway, after 13 days and 40 nights, we ran into the Russians in an East German town of Trwitz. Eventually, they were taken by Americans. My first two English words were Hershey-born chewing gum. And I still remember the Americans all had brass collars with US on it, but all the Americans had watches up and down their arms that they stole from Germans, corpses, and we called them US Uhrensammlers, watch collectors. So, it's the kind of thing that just sticks in your mind. We finally came back to Holland, and the Dutch put us in a concentration camp with Nazis because my parents were German, and my father was well connected. And 10 days later got us out and decided that Europe was no place for us, and we came here. You want to pick out the...
Thank you, Mr. Hess, for sharing your experiences.
You can call me Steve, I don't have a PhD.
And for making your father's memoirs available. I'm sure you're going to get have a busy evening tonight with the emails that are coming.
Happy to do it. I'm unemployed. My wife fired me last week.
Any questions for Mr. Hess?
Thank you very much for sharing your story. I think it's one that needs to be told over and over again. I think your point is, never forget about this. That's one of your main points. But is there another point that you think of that you want us to spread other than never forget this?
First of all, I acknowledge I'm non-religious and I'm cynical. And to me the bottom line is evil exists. And you could, normally when you're preaching against prejudice, so you tend to be preaching to the choir. There's a lot of evil, but the very recent reemergence of anti-Semitism in this country, I don't feel as a threat, but it's very disturbing that people who are ignorant. I talked to with grade school kids, and he asked them when was the World War II. They don't even know, so that's disappointing. So I try and pass on history, and a lot of people can't believe it ever happened. So the visuals are important, and without them, it's just a story. But I'll tell you the day after 9/11, I had met my latest and best wife, and we had just moved to a condo on the water in Aranaquoy, and she's a psychiatrist, which I needed all along. She went to work. I had sold my business and was enjoying retirement until she insisted I help her run her practice. She came home and we just moved, and I was in the living room mesmerized to television, like those of you who are old enough were. And I was cleaning guns, and my wife came home who has no problems with my little hobbies, and she said, "What are you doing?" She said, "I'm cleaning handguns." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Well, they were packed up and all, they need to be cleaned." And she looked at me as only she could, and she went, but I remember the fear just rose in me.
So really, educate.
Education is good.
I've been to Auschwitz, and to me, there were no words to even describe it.
Yeah.
It was just beyond belief. And I know I've talked with people in this country that, may have some hesitation on really believing what happened, and one trip to someplace like that will really change your belief system.
When I went to Auschwitz for the first time, a better time at least, with my sons, we walked to the back of the Birkenau barrack, and there were latrines, which are cement things that look, the Jews in Bergen-Belsen called them egg racks, the ovals, or if you use this stuff you'll never hear again. There was a very famous Dutch department ice cream store called Dumba, that doesn't exist anymore, and you would buy an ice cream cone and they would stick it in the holes by the cashier. And so the latrine, the filthy latrine in the Dutch Jews called it Dumba, because it had the holes where you stuck the ice cream stuff. But I was in Birkenau with my sons, and I was telling them, too bad we have kids here, I could tell you what I really told them. I told them how the latrines worked, and there was a man in charge, his office I won't pronounce. In Germany it's a Scheissmaster, you might be able to just decipher it. And it was a prestige job, no heavy lifting, and it was inside. People loved a job like that. And you had 20 seconds to, and I know it's gross, but if you can understand it, because everything was covered with you know what, because the diphtheria was all over the place, the Jews tried not to, well, not Jews, anybody tried not to sit down. And so they would squat, but they were too weak, and they would just flop down, and that caused, in Bergen-Belsen, this horrendous disease, the typhus that just killed everybody.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
You know, I turned 60 this past year, so I was a high school student, early to mid-70s. And it wasn't until 1976 that I saw this TV show called Holocaust, and it starred Meryl Streep. That was the first time I heard about the Holocaust.
You know, Sophie's Choice, wasn't that?
Yeah, it was
Meryl
with,
Streep.
oh God, Fritz Weaver.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, wasn't close enough. And I saw it and I said, how could I have gone to school and not learned any of this? If anything, it was like a side note, this happened, but I don't even think that was the case. Did you have trouble, I mean, do you know whether that was the case with a lot of school districts, learning about the Holocaust?
I'm self-taught. The Holocaust was never taught in schools I was in. It's required in New York State. Some teachers take it seriously, and and they call me, and others pass it by as quickly as possible. So it's the education is seriously lacking.
Yeah, I just began to wonder whether school districts said, listen, we're not going to tell kids.
I'll tell you a strange thing. I don't do this for a living. I do it once in a while and less. But I've spoken to many schools in Greece and the Chile and all. And Brighton, which is heavily Jewish, is the only district that's never asked me to come and speak. And my good friend, the rabbi who moved to Florida, I said to him, it's bizarre. I should have a standing gig in Brighton, but it's the only school district I was never asked to speak to. So I just can't explain it, but it's interesting. Part of my cynicism.
No, I've got the same cynicism. Don't worry.
I grew up in Germany under the Nazis, and I don't remember, and of course during that time, during the Nazis were in power until 1945, of course we didn't hear anything about the treatment of other people, of the Jews. And all that that information became then available at the end of the war of 1945, which also, of course, was the end of the Nazi government, if you want to call it a government. It is, I've seen, I'm informed myself about the Holocaust to a certain extent, and I've seen pictures, etc. But I'm particularly overwhelmed, if that is the right word, of some of the photographs, really. You have, for instance, the mountain of people who have died, and in the foreground people have to get something together to eat. There are other pictures which are just something in you, really, on me, almost refuses to acknowledge that could that really have happened. For instance, being German, the Germans, we learned in school, das Volk der Dichter und Denker, the country of the poets and thinkers, and then at the other end you have that that mentality. It's difficult to find a name for it. I mean, it comes to mind that we, the humans, are the only one. No other creature on this earth, all the animals we call wild and brutal, etc. No, we are the worst, and we can be the most brutal of all of them. And one just remains speechless, really. What is it in us, really, that we can do these things? We know we can do terrible things to other animals, really, but to ourselves? And it just remains to me sort of a riddle. And also, is there anything one can do in order to make it clear to everyone, to get it in everyone's consciousness, what we can do, how brutal we can do, and what we should do in order not to allow circumstances for us to use this brutality. We've done it again. We are doing it against the planet, really. Luckily, we only have now one planet. If we get another planet, we will try to destroy that planet too. It has come to a point where we ourselves really don't seem to be able for long to live on our planet, really. With this self-destruction, and also then, the destruction toward each other. And then you just wonder, is there anything really one could try to circumvent it, or do we just are we just destined to go along this path, really, of destruction and cruelty?
Wir haben jetzt bessere Zeiten.
Pardon?
Wir leben in besseren Zeiten.
Wir leben in besseren Zeiten, yeah. Right.
Thank you for your comment.
Anyway, thanks for.
Thank you.
Sorry for me talking.
No.
Thanks, you were great.
Thank you.
That's, the woman used the word riddle, and I always kind of thought this was a riddle. Maybe you can help me understand it. The Jews are known as Christ killers, labeled by mainly Christians. But in Christianity, if Jesus doesn't die and his blood is spilled, there's no new covenant. So,
Can you get on the mic a little bit better?
Can you help me explain that? It's like,
well,
you get the benefits of going to heaven, but you're persecuting the people responsible for it.
well, number one, I'm not religious, and since religion is pretty much based on faith, my own feeling, because I've been asked often, believe in God, are you religious? And I said, if I see what happened in Auschwitz and there was someone overlooking that, he should have lost his job, he or she should have lost his job long ago. I mean, I don't believe in anything. But the interesting thing is I thought, I mean, religion is what it is. It's different. But the interesting was 10 years ago, I got very sick, what happens to aging males at times. And I was really scared. And I thought, boy, this is it. And I did not get along well with my father. I was a big disappointment. My father was really never recovered from the Holocaust. And it wasn't until 20 years, I remember looking down in his grave and thinking, free at last, free at last. I remember it. And 20 years later, after I'd gone through my own crap, a divorce and stuff like that, I visited his grave and I sort of made peace. But the interesting thing is, to talk about religion, is I got very sick and still got it. Managed to last 10 years. And every time I had a scan or something like that, or a test, I always thought, the spirit of my father watches over me. And it always turned out to be
That's great.
I mean, that's my spirituality. But, you know, I mean, the real answer is that those who went into the camps and survived and went in religious came out religious. And those who went in without religion, and if they came out, stayed that way. That was not a place to find God. And so you had to go there with that feeling.
And I also, like, the kingdom of heaven is promised to the Jews, right? And the Jews are constantly being kicked out of wherever they end up being. And I just find it ironic that, like, now they got to share heaven with Christians.
Well, you know,
What's next, you know?
and the Jews often say, you know, people accuse the Jews of claiming they're the chosen people, and the Jews say, why can't they choose somebody else?
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation. Sorry, I'm just stealing the mic here. I was just wondering if your family has any memories or stories of the day-to-day dealings with your captors, the folks you saw every day.
The actual thing is that the Nazis, the soldiers tended to stay out of the camps because they were such hellholes and so dangerous. And the day-to-day, I mean, they were around, you saw them at Appel and all. The day-to-day management of the camps was done by capos, who were worse than the Germans. They tended to be political prisoners, not often Jews, but they were prisoners. And they were brutal. My father was at the witness. The British asked him to go back to Lüneburg in 1946. It's in the book for those of you who want. To be a witness against a copper named Casimir. And on my wall is his death certificate, October 10th, 1946, when he was hanged. I regretted it that it was the birth date of one of my favorite dogs. But the Germans were so over. You know, people talk about. I mean, I wish we had more time. People talk about resistance. It wouldn't have made any difference. The Germans were so all powerful. If you resisted the German by sabotage, they would kill either 1 out of 10 or 10 for every German that was hurt. If the concentration camps like Treblinka were surrounded by minefields, if they had a breakout, which they had occasionally, everybody got either recaptured and hanged or killed. There was just, even in the ghetto, the only time that there was resistance is when there was no hope. It was symbolic. There was just no way to fight the Germans. They just were too powerful, and they had weapons and were so brutal. I mean, they just, if there was an uprising, they would just machine gun everybody. They wouldn't say, well, this person, you know, shot at a German officer, let's kill him. That would make sense. They would just kill 100 people for that, and that sort of dissuaded people from trying that.
I want to neglect this side of the house. I'll ask you a question en route. Acknowledging the failure of the modern educational system to keep the Holocaust sort of on everyone's radar, to learn the lessons of that, accepting that most people, not just students, but the public in general, derives most of its understanding of history through film. Is there any particular film that you would recommend that you've seen that really captures the experience?
Well, there was one I definitely don't recommend. It's a beautiful, was one, I forget the, yeah, that one I definitely not recommend. But Shoah, which is 9 hours long, was very well. Schindler's List was although it wasn't accurate in many ways. You know, when Commander Girth was shooting down the prisoners, his house was actually below. We were shooting up, but details. But Schindler's List, I think, was well done. Sophie's Choice was very well done. Again, Shoah, 9 hours of it. It takes a little perseverance to see that one. Those are well done. But unless you first starve the cast for half a year, you know, and really get them and bring in the lice, you can only approach, you know, it's like Star Wars. You can only go so far. But those films, I would recommend. If any of you want to do some reading, I just finished. We're talking about a book by Professor Hayes called Why the Holocaust. But it's, if you Google it, his name is Hayes on Amazon. It's Why. It was the best, and I have hundreds of books. It was the best single text if you want the details about the Holocaust. I mean, I could frankly keep you here for 2 days and not run out of remembrances and facts. We came to America, and even that was horrible. And one day, some of my relatives took me out to a restaurant. First time I was in a restaurant, and we came to a crummy apartment in Manhattan. My mother locked all the 7 locks, and I looked around. I was 9 years old. And I had all the rolls in my pocket from the table. And my mother said to me, "You don't have to do that anymore." And then the last little vignette similar was my previous wife, not my latest best. My previous wife, who lives in Pittsburgh, when I was married to her, a nice lady. I came home. I worked 6 days a week too, just I still do it now, 7 days. Anyway, I came home. My wife said that the microwave was broken, and I love toys. And in those days there was a store called Leachmere, and I took one of my kids and I said, "Let's go buy another one." And women are creatures of habit, and my wife's habit, among others, was to keep a loaf of bread next to the refrigerator on top of the microwave. So I went to Leachmere, all the buttons, this one gets the best one, and went up the steps with a new microwave in Pittsburgh many years after the war. And I had to take the broken one to the basement for the trash on Tuesday. So I picked up the broken one, and behind it was a piece of bread. Old, good, not old, as my daughter would say, God knows how old, and my former wife, Irene, took this piece of bread and started walking towards the trash. And I said, "Irene, don't do that." And I ate it. And I cannot throw bread away. And my latest and best wife, a psychiatrist, knows about these things and would never subject me to stale bread and makes it into crumbs for salad, because she knows that I cannot throw. If I see a piece of bread with green on it, I scrape it off, because bread was the lifeblood in the camp. From our birthday in 1945, January 14th, if you want to send me a card, my mother traded her last piece of jewelry, a wedding band, for 2 pieces of bread with sprinkles. In Dutch they're called neusjes, little mice. And my sister got one, and I got one. And my sister kept that one for, she says weeks, but maybe not, but for several days anyway, and ate it piece by piece, and I gobbled mine up. She was smarter. But bread was, if you could get it, was the lifeblood of the camp. And you'd do anything for that. So even to this day, I have these my own craziness.
I wanted to speak to two ideas that you've mentioned, and one idea is how important it is not to lose this narrative, because to me the most frightening thing is that people are forgetting, because it will allow this kind of thing to happen again. And the second is the piece about whether you're invited to show the pictures or not. And I think those pictures, like you said, are a very important part of making this palatable and painful. And when I was an exchange student in West Germany, the school there was very careful to educate the students, and they showed a very brutal and raw documentary that showed how brutal and raw it was. And they showed it the first day, and it was so upsetting that a lot of students ended up leaving the classroom in distress. So what they did was they then showed it the next class period, because they said, no, you need to see this entire thing. And as an exchange student, my host family ensured that I went and visited the concentration camp that was near Hamburg, and the organization that brought the students to Germany also made sure that we went to Berlin and saw another concentration camp. And so what I was experiencing in the late 1980s was this really dedicated work that educators were doing to make sure that people learned the history and didn't forget. So I just want to thank you for being part of that, and thank Bob Brown for being part of that too.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So you mentioned how anti-Semitism is coming back into the United States, and as a young person today, it's really scary to see how people are being treated. And as a person who went through a lot of oppression and growing up in a very oppressive society, and going into adulthood in a different place, in a newer, more accepting society, I was wondering how you would think about like what young people should be doing to kind of combat the more tyrannical kind of rhetoric that's coming into today's society.
You don't have my answer. I think they should not take student loans and spend their parents $60,000 to go out and parade and protest. When I went to school, I actually went to class. That was never so. I'm just, my politics are, I think kids are protesting just for the sake of protest. Kids are cruel, and that's nothing new. But I think study and education really is our only hope. This new anti-Semitism, which by the way is a total shift. It's not the classical, it's a shift from what used to be right-wing anti-Semitism to left-wing Semitism, and it's since Jesus is not central to the Muslim religion. It's not based on Christian anti-Semitism, which was the founding, but it's based upon a hatred of the only democracy in the Mideast of Israel. So it's a different kind of anti-Semitism, but the effects are just as bad. Can it happen again? Well, who knows? I have to think it can't, but I've been wrong before. So, thank you. I'll share one thing with you. It came to my mind. Years ago, I was teaching a college class, and one very serious kid came up to me and he said, "How can you joke about stuff like this?" It was embarrassing for him to ask me that. because I do have a sense of humor. So it was a little embarrassing for him to ask me, but I couldn't blow him off. I said, it's the only way I can handle it. And that was the best answer. Because I'm aware that I make light of something that maybe ought not to, but I really find it's the only thing it's the only way that I can deal with it. If I think too much about it, it's even more depressing than it is. Anybody else?
I was just curious on what your thoughts were coming to America and what it was like arriving in America after.
That was rough because I had never gone to school. Unlike refugees today, unfortunately, my parents called us together, the four of us, and they said, we are now Americans, we'll speak English. Well, there was chewing gum, there was Hershey bar, and Pennies from Heaven, the first movie I saw on the boat coming over. Kind of limited. But my parents spoke several languages. But they stuck us in the third grade because they didn't know where else to stick us. But 6 months later, my sister and I never spoke Dutch again, and I had forgotten it completely. For some reason, I know German, and I don't really know why. It just was probably around too much. But I can get along German, but not in Dutch. The toughest thing for me, and I remember this, was that I had no role models. My father just worked, and since sports are so important to especially males in America, whenever a ball came my way, I would go like this. And I remember being in summer camp. The word camp was very upsetting the first time I went, but my parents sent us. We had a softball game, and the two captains were to choose the teams. I was standing there. I always got a right field with instructions to get out of the way. And I remember that they went hand over hand on the bat till they had the last one. Do they still do that? Oh, I never knew that. And so he was at the first dress. I remember his words exactly. You get Hess. We had him last time. I have been to one sporting event in my life. My nephew is very successful, owns 2 tennis teams and a bunch of companies and a private jet. And he has four seats ringside at the Wizards or whatever, the basketball team. And he insisted on me going with him. And I said, I don't want to go. He said, they have free beer. So I went. It's the only sporting event I ever went to. My ex-wife loved football. On Monday night, I'd say, why is this guy running back and forth when everybody's like this? It's going to suck. So that was very painful for me to grow up being an outcast because I never knew. I could not tell you who played in the Super Bowl, and I don't really care. Now it doesn't matter at all. And the pride I took was when I built my company with 80 people. In Chile, we had a softball, a hardball, a smaller one. That's the hardball team, and they won a cup in Chile. And I said, well, if I can't do it, at least I'm hiring the right people. And at the last inning, when they couldn't possibly lose, they got me up to bat, and the pitcher just sort of lobbed it at me, so I could have hit it with a matchstick. And but that was the toughest time growing up do we still have 2 minutes?
Yes, I think so.
If not, it's fine.
No problem. Yeah.
Quick story. I was probably the only Holocaust kid in Columbia. The only other kid more depressed was General MacArthur's son, Arthur MacArthur. And anyway, I had a very famous professor, Professor Stern, who specialized in this area. He knew I was a Holocaust survivor, but he was interested in me, but we had no relationship. And I didn't appreciate his fame because I was a college kid. He was just a teacher. Anyway, I never did the work. I went to Columbia. Had I been an athlete, I would have had a C on my jacket to my grade average. But it wasn't until I was, 1984, Bitburg, when I really became a scholar, a serious scholar of the period. And I was reading his latest book, Dreams and Delusions. And I'm saying to my wife, who's got more degrees than a thermometer, and I said to her, God, did I waste school? This book is so great. And she said to me, why don't you email him? Oh no, I had the final. That was the point. I took the final, didn't read the book. but I'm a really good writer. So here's the blue book, I'm writing back and forth and all. I got the blue book back, I think it was a B+, I was greatly relieved. And it said, great exposition, good logic, fine observations. You would have gotten an A had you read the book. I was reading, years later, I was reading Dreams and Delusions. At that time, his last book, he died 2 years ago. I was telling my very intellectual best wife ever. And she said, why don't you try and email him and tell him you like this book? Email him. Because in those days, they had CompuServe or AOL. I managed to get it, and I just wrote, Dear Professor Stern, I was in your class in 1963. I just read Dreams and Delusions and wanted to let you know what a fabulous book it was. A week later, I got back a single sentence from him and said, Dear Mr. Hess, delighted you finally read the book. Thank you.
We actually have two very quick but insistent questions here, if we have a couple more minutes to spare.
I can be here all day.
Mr. Hess, thank you so much for presenting today. I'm back here in the back. Thank you.
Oh, there you are.
And there you are.
Yeah.
I'm Portuguese of descent, and the island that my mother and family are from is Terceira Azores. And one of the big cities near where my mother was born was called Porto Judeu, which loosely translated is Port of the Jews. And that was long before Christopher Columbus. In fact, the church in that town was built 30 years before he was born. So now in this day and age, knowing that so many of your survivors are passing on, so many of the greatest generation, which I include you in, are passing on, and knowing my history and my culture, knowing that so many Jews went to Brazil, went to Argentina, went to Venezuela and Central America, how are you finding these people to retell these stories and to keep them active in the lives of the people now? Because it's ever so important. And I'll pass the mic to
you're not. I remember vividly, we got a TV set in the late 40s. My father was always the last one to get the latest stuff. Used to have to go next door to watch Moon Pearl. Anyway, I remember a program, and they brought out the last surviving soldier from the Spanish-American War. And even though I was pretty young at the time, I said to either my sister or my mother, I said, one day it's going to be me. Spielberg, I've been recorded for these tapes 3 times. My mother has, my sister has. I don't think people watch them. Researchers go for them, but when we're gone, we're gone. It's like the Civil War. That's why really it's so important to read. I mean, to me, the greatest gift is I carry my Kindle with me at a stoplight. I pull up my Kindle. So if I can encourage you, one thing, read, get educated, stay educated.
Thank you. I think I have one last question right over there.
Sure.
With the world we find ourselves in now, where there's so many willing and wanting to be unreasonable in the acceptance of these facts that the rest of us find to be truths, how do you go about maintaining your sanity and a day-to-day with approaching people like that and people who would want to deny that any of this had happened?
I just don't, my thoughts just don't go there. Now, I realize there are a lot of kooks in the world, and I'm pretty depressed what's happening to our country, but I don't dwell on it because, frankly, I'm powerless. I'm one vote, and I just hope that enough people with good hearts and have to, no matter how you are, I'm disappointed in both parties. I don't have an answer with it. I find it depressing. This was I served 4 years as a naval officer. In my day, I can't say everybody, but everybody, my best friend today still was a fellow Navy officer on board our destroyer. The captain I was friendly with until he died 2 years ago. Today, no one's in the military except the poor kids from Iowa, the farmers who are in the South or so. But Harvard and Yale, they don't serve in the military. But, I mean, they wouldn't do that. So what I really regret is the loss of patriotism. I mean, if this country is so bad, why do so many people want to come here? And I mean, why don't they go the other town? When I hear it, I say, much could have Venezuela, you know. To me, I owe my life to this country. We have a 20-foot flagpole. We fly the flag every day. I owe my life to this country. I never turned down an invitation from the military. Always wear my flag. We have our faults. We have plenty of them. But where else would you live? You know. So that's where I come from. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again.